The night sky over Europe was thick with tension, the kind that seemed to press down on every cockpit, every city, every decision. It was the spring of 1941, and the war had already reshaped the continent. Bombers roared across the darkness. Fighters hunted shadows, and every flight carried the weight of strategy, fear, and ideology. But on one particular night, something happened that did not fit the logic of war. A single aircraft crossed the North Sea, not as part of an invasion, not as part of a bombing run, but on a mission so strange that even today it feels like something pulled from fiction. The pilot was not an ordinary man. He was Rudolf Hess, one of the most powerful figures in Nazi Germany, deputy Führer to Adolf Hitler. Hess was deeply embedded in the ideological core of the regime. He had stood beside Hitler from the early days, shared prison time after the failed Beer Hall Putsch, and helped shape the vision that would plunge Europe into chaos. Yet on this night, he climbed into a Messerschmitt aircraft alone, without escort, without clear authorization, and flew toward Britain. To understand how such a moment could occur, one must step into the mindset of Hess himself. He was not a conventional strategist. He was deeply influenced by mysticism, astrology, and a personal belief that he had a destiny intertwined with the fate of Germany. While others in the Nazi leadership focused on military planning and political maneuvering, Hess increasingly drifted into a world of intuition and grand visions. He believed that he could play a decisive role in ending the war between Germany and Britain, a war he considered unnecessary and even tragic. In his mind, Britain and Germany were natural allies. Both were powerful nations with imperial ambitions. Both feared the spread of communism. And both shared what he saw as a cultural connection. The war, he believed, was a result of misunderstandings and political miscalculations. If only the right message could be delivered to the right people, peace could be achieved. This belief did not emerge overnight. Hess had spent months contemplating the idea of a personal mission to Britain. He studied maps, flight routes, and the capabilities of aircraft. He consulted astrologers, who reinforced his conviction that the timing was right. And perhaps most importantly, he became increasingly isolated within the Nazi leadership. His influence was waning, overshadowed by figures like Hermann Göring and Heinrich Himmler. The man who had once been at the center of power was now drifting toward the margins. On the evening of his flight, Hess prepared carefully. The aircraft he chose was a modified Messerschmitt Bf-110, a twin-engine fighter that could handle long distances. He wore a flight suit and carried documents outlining a proposal for peace. These documents were meant for a specific individual, the Duke of Hamilton, a British aristocrat whom Hess believed might be sympathetic to his ideas. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft lifted into the sky, Hess was not acting on orders. There is no credible evidence that Hitler approved the mission. In fact, everything suggests that this was a personal initiative, driven by conviction rather than command. That alone made the flight extraordinary. A senior Nazi leader was leaving Germany in the middle of a war, fly alone into enemy territory, on a mission that had not been sanctioned. The journey itself was dangerous. Flying across the North Sea at night required precision and endurance. Hess navigated using limited instruments, relying on his training and determination. The aircraft pushed forward through darkness, the hum of engines constant, the horizon invisible. Below him lay cold water and the uncertainty of what awaited him on the other side. As he approached the British Isles, the situation became even more precarious. British radar systems detected incoming aircraft, and defenses were alert. Hess descended, attempting to avoid detection, but the strain on both pilot and machine was growing. Fuel was running low. Navigation was becoming more difficult, and yet he pressed on, convinced that he was on the verge of a historic breakthrough. Eventually, the moment came when Hess could no longer continue in the aircraft. Over Scotland, he made a decision to abandon the plane. He bailed out, parachuting into the darkness below. The landing was rough. He came down in a field near Eaglesham, disoriented but alive. The aircraft crashed elsewhere, its mission complete in a way no one could have predicted. On the ground, Hess encountered a local farmer. Introducing himself under a false name at first, he soon revealed his true identity. Imagine the scene: a high-ranking Nazi official, standing in a Scottish field, claiming to be on a mission of peace. It must have sounded unbelievable. And yet it was real. He was quickly taken into custody by British authorities. The news spread rapidly, causing shock on both sides of conflict. In Britain, officials were skeptical. Was this a genuine attempt at negotiation or some elaborate deception? Intelligence officers interrogated Hess, trying to understand his motives and the extent of his authority. Hess insisted that he had come to negotiate peace. He spoke of shared interests, of a potential alliance against the Soviet Union, and of a future where Britain and Germany would coexist without conflict. But his proposals were disconnected from reality. Britain, under the leadership of Winston Churchill, had no interest in negotiating with the Nazi regime. The war was not a misunderstanding to be resolved through personal diplomacy. It was a struggle against aggression and tyranny. Churchill himself dismissed the mission. To him, Hess was either delusional or irrelevant. The idea that a single individual, even one as prominent as Hess, could alter the course of the war through an unsanctioned flight was implausible. The British government treated him not as a diplomat, but as a prisoner. Meanwhile, in Germany, the reaction was swift and severe. Hitler was furious. Publicly, the Nazi regime declared Hess insane, distancing itself from his actions. The narrative was clear. This was not an official mission, but the act of a man who had lost his mind. Hess was stripped of his positions, his name removed from the inner circle of power. Privately, the situation was more complex. Hitler may have been genuinely shocked, or he may have seen the political necessity of denying any connection. Either way, the message was unmistakable. Hess's flight had not brought peace. It had ended his career and left him isolated from both sides. In captivity, Hess's situation became increasingly strange. He was held in various locations, including the Tower of London for a time. His behavior was erratic. He claimed memory loss, exhibited paranoia, and at times seemed detached from reality. Some believed he was pretending. Others believed the psychological strain had taken a real toll. Years passed, and the war continued. Hess remained a prisoner, a relic of a moment that had once seemed potentially transformative but had instead become a historical curiosity. When the war ended, he was put on trial at the Nuremberg trials, alongside other leading figures of the Nazi regime. At Nuremberg, Hess faced charges of crimes against peace and conspiracy. His defense was complicated by his behavior. At times, he claimed amnesia, refusing to acknowledge his role. At other times, he spoke clearly, revealing flashes of the man he had once been. The court ultimately found him guilty, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. He spent the rest of his life in Spandau prison in Berlin. Decades passed, and Hess became its most famous inmate. Long after the war had ended, long after the world had changed, he remained behind bars. He died there in 1987, his life defined by both his role in one of history's darkest regimes and by the bizarre flight that had taken him to Britain. The story of Rudolf Hess's flight is often described as a mistake, but that word does not fully capture its nature. It was not a navigational error or a simple miscalculation. It was a collision between ideology and reality, between personal belief and geopolitical truth. Hess did not accidentally land in Britain. He deliberately flew there, driven by a vision that only he seemed to fully believe. What makes the story enduring is its strangeness. In a war defined by massive armies, strategic planning, and industrial-scale conflict, this was an intensely personal act. One man, one aircraft, one idea. And yet, it had no real impact on the course of the war. It did not bring peace. It did not alter alliances. It simply became a footnote, albeit a fascinating one. And perhaps that is the most revealing aspect of all. Even within a regime as rigid and controlled as Nazi Germany, individuals could act in unpredictable ways. Hess's flight reminds us that history is not only shaped by grand strategies and collective movements, but also by the decisions of individuals, however misguided they may be. On that night in 1941, as the aircraft crossed the dark waters toward Britain, Rudolf Hess believed he was about to change the world. Instead, he stepped into a different kind of history, one defined not by triumph or success, but by mystery, failure, an enduring question of why he chose to